Hi. Today is the second conversation about feedback. Let's quickly recap what we talked about in the first conversation. The guiding principle being feedback is the breakfast of champions. It's the most important meal of the workday. And feedback is something that really helps medical writers grow in their career. Recapping the first conversation, we talked about the MAT format of providing feedback. M stands for messaging, A stands for articulation, and T stands for technical aspects of feedback. In today's conversation, we'll talk about receiving feedback. What are some ways in which you can receive that feedback, and how can we act and become better medical writers when we receive feedback? Specifically with reference to two different scenarios. Scenario one being receiving little feedback, and scenario two being receiving a lot of feedback. So let's talk about the first scenario. When we receive little feedback, it doesn't specifically mean that we have done a perfect job. When we receive little feedback, it could also mean that there were certain elements of that project which the reader didn't fully understand, didn't fully comprehend. Think about it. It is only when you understand something would you be willing to ask questions about it. When you don't understand anything, if everything is just completely above your head, it's difficult to formulate questions about what you just heard. The same is true about receiving little feedback, which is why it's extremely important for any medical writer to check and make sure that the reader doesn't want to add anything further. One way of doing this is to just simply ask, were there any aspects of this project which require further explanation, which require further clarification? Another way is to simply ask, are you sure there's nothing further you'd like to add before we move on to the next step with this project? And that's one way of responding to receiving little feedback. What about those instances when we receive a lot of feedback? This is where the MAT format comes into play again, because when we receive a lot of feedback, we can take all that feedback and begin sectioning it off into separate buckets. Feedback with reference to messaging, that goes in one bucket, feedback with reference to articulation, and feedback with reference to the technical aspects. Now, the last portion, feedback with reference to technical aspects, is something that we can begin working on immediately. Those are fixes and edits that we can begin working on immediately. Now, the other two, messaging and articulation, require a little more conversation. If you are a medical writer who is working in a company along with other medical writers, perhaps along with other team members such as a biostatistician, a scientist, a doctor, or any other members within the team, a project manager, for instance, when you receive a lot of feedback, it's a really good opportunity to call a team meeting and discuss the messaging aspects and articulation aspects of the feedback. However, if you are working in a freelance position and you have more face-to-face direct communication with the person you're writing for, you can always request a few minutes of their time to talk about the messaging and articulation aspects of resolving a lot of feedback. So a few thumb rules to keep in mind are, when you receive little feedback, always check that everything has been fully understood, and always check that no one else in the process wants to add anything further. When you receive a lot of feedback, fix as much of it as possible, specifically the technical aspects. And it's always a good idea to initiate some form of a meeting or a communication with either an internal team if you're working in a larger company, or directly with the person you're writing for if you're working in a freelance capacity, and take it from there. So think about that, and all the best.